And I think if you ask a woman what she wants in a relationship, surely a significant part of it is to be treasured. And I think that pornography kind of inverts those desires. And so the man, instead of being the protector that he ought to be, ends up becoming a predator. He doesn't give of his strength. He takes the strength from another. And the woman, instead of being treasured, becomes a sort of target. And so in that sense, I think it plays a big part in messing up our relationships.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of The Naked Gospel. It is our hope and vision to see a revival of sexual dignity and integrity throughout the entire Bride of Christ. To that end, we bring on guests to discuss topics from sexual ethics to marriage, pornography, to sex trafficking, and everything in between. I am your host, Shane O'Neill. Today we are joined by Matt Fradd. Matt is a father of 4. He's a husband. He's a best-selling author. He's always working on something. And his work in particular, The Porn Myth, has gone a long way in helping us evaluate the myths that we believe and assume culturally when it comes to pornography, whether that be that porn isn't addictive, or that porn only impacts the individual, or that it can be helpful in marriage, even helping us to see the harrowing connection between pornography and sex trafficking. So I am super thrilled to be able to sit down with him and dialogue with him. Matt, how are you, man?
G'day, I'm well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Very much, Serge. So before we jump into the stuff, just a quick update on your family. Obviously, COVID's been touching all of our lives, some more than others, and I know that it's been impacting you guys. So how are you?
Yeah, we were pretty sick. We had a few scares. I was rushed to the emergency room. My wife was too, and then admitted into hospital. But we had the tests, and they came back negative. So according to those tests, we did not have COVID-19, or do not right now. So I don't know what it was. It was unlike anything we've ever had before. It was very brutal. Yeah. But my wife just finished a round of antibiotics, and I'm feeling on the mend too. So thankfully, we're all well.
That's awesome. And the kids are holding up okay in the midst of that?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, when mom and dad are sick, it's a scary thing, I imagine, for a kid. So it's good to hear that they're holding up well. Yeah. Okay. So jumping into your work in particular with the porn myth, I suppose, because you outline a lot of myths that we culturally believe or assume when it comes to pornography. What are some of the ones, whether it's 3 or 4, just one, that you feel like are the biggest, the most impactful, some of the ones that are most glaring that we just assume in it? Because honestly, your work is incredible. I think it belongs on every pastor's bookshelf and every counseling office, because even like the way you break it down in the appendices, where it goes through the neurological impact, the relational impact, all of that stuff, the societal impact. So the breadth is massive. And so I guess I'd just be interested to hear some of the more salient points that strike you as you've been working through this.
Yeah, thanks so much. I basically sat down and I asked myself, what are the myths we tend to believe about pornography? I wrote to several friends, asked them the same thing, and I just compiled as many myths that I could think of. And I suppose when it comes to the most prominent myths, that would depend on, I guess, who we're talking about. I think there are those who are trying to justify their use of pornography, who might like to tell themselves that watching pornography is somehow masculine, that it's liberating for the women in the industry. Those who are against pornography are somehow prudish or frigid, that they have a negative view of sexuality. If it's for some of us who recognize that pornography is detrimental in large doses, we might want to say that, well, pornography is kind of like gambling. As long as you don't go overboard, it's really okay. So it really depends, I suppose, on who we're talking about. But as I point out in the book, over the last 40 or so years, there's been a lot of studies that have come out of academia, as you know, from different branches of science, and all of it is saying unambiguously that porn is just not good for the consumer, for our relationships, and for society. And it's been really cool because, even though I'm a Christian, it's been neat to see many non-Christian groups and websites and organizations begin to speak out against pornography solely because of anecdotal evidence, testimony from people, and then what science is saying.
No, that's helpful. I suppose double clicking on the issue of the individualism, because we're such an individualistic society. culturally we conceive of ourselves as individuals that then kind of assimilate, as opposed to being assimilated and then gaining a sense of identity from there. And so, I mean, the paradigmatic image for pornography is somebody alone in a dark room in a corner watching porn, and there is kind of this lie even amongst Christians that, like, okay, sure, maybe it impacts me, but it definitely doesn't impact other people because I'm doing it in isolation. No one knows about it. When you hear that, because I know you engage that issue in the book, how do you go about approaching that? I mean, what is, okay, if I were to say, what is the problem then?
Right. Yeah. And you can look at the problem from different angles. There's the production of pornography, which I believe to be problematic. There is the so-called acting and participation in pornography, which is essentially prostitution with a camera in the room, which is problematic. There's the distribution of a medium which distorts the meaning of our sexuality and the goodness of sexuality. There's the consumption of it, which teaches us lies about masculinity and femininity and the goodness of sex. So it really depends on what you want to look at. I think the Catechism of the Catholic Church has a section on this, and it says that pornography immerses all who are involved in the illusion of a fantasy world. And so whether that's at the level of the filming, the production, the distribution, or the consuming, it's harmful on every level. No, I'm happy to drill into one in particular if you want to, but
yeah, I suppose I'd be interested. I think there's the faculty of imagination is significant. A lot of people don't necessarily engage the faculty of imagination. When you use the word imagination, typically they correlate with imaginary. And so the idea of like stewarding even imagination, and that we have an ethical imagination, and that frames our relationships. It frames the way we approach people. It frames the way a husband loves his wife and a guy pursues a girl, or vice versa. Did you find any of that in your work when it came to, I guess the relational impact, the immediate kind of, relational impact of pornography upon relationships?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. You know, when you sort of sit a man down and take him seriously and ask him what it is he desires, if you do something similar for women, and maybe you restrict that kind of desire to just our romantic relationships and marriage and things like that, I think you tend to find that men want to guard, fight for, protect. You know, I don't think there's many men out there who, should their girlfriend be attacked, would be proud of throwing up his arms and running away. Yeah. We love movies in which the man sacrifices himself or some part of himself for the good of his country or his beloved, right? So we want to protect. And I think the only reason we would say with a straight face that we don't is only if we thought that we were incapable of it. And so we turn that virtue into a vice, as it were. And I think if you ask a woman what she wants in a relationship, surely a significant part of it is to be treasured. And I think that pornography kind of inverts those desires. And so the man, instead of being the protector that he ought to be, ends up becoming a predator. He doesn't give of his strength. He takes the strength from another. And the woman, instead of being treasured, becomes a sort of target. And so in that sense, I think it plays a big part in messing up our relationships. There are currently over 70 studies that show a correlation between porn use and sexual dissatisfaction. And so I often say, if, you know, based on that, if you would like to be sexually frustrated, pornography is the way to go. As my friend Jason Everett has said, pornography is the perfect way to shoot your future marriage in the head, because it's a lie about the goodness of sex and the marital union. And so that when you begin to engage in that in a healthy way, it's like you've got porn goggles on and you see everything in a kind of distorted, warped fashion, and you don't know how to engage in it in a way that's true, good, and beautiful. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. I guess this would apply more to a secular audience, but it seems fairly common as I come across articles and whatnot that porn within marriage is becoming more of a staple of our society. That it's used to spice things up, or even as an educational way of engaging romantically. What did some of the data point out about that? I mean, you were alluding alluding to it in actually rather graphic language when it comes to shooting your marriage in the head. How does that play out?
Right. So those studies that I referenced earlier, over 70, can all be found at my friend Gary Wilson's website, yourbrainonporn.com. And it's not the case that, well, if you are in a sexual relationship prior to marriage and view porn, then it's detrimental. But once you're married, then it's somehow okay. The same thing would hold. So it's a matter of infidelity that here is this woman, and I want to give her all that I have. I want to love her. I want to cherish her. And when I engage in the sexual act, I'm saying with my body what I once said with my voice at the altar. I want our love to be free, total, faithful, and fruitful, right? Not dominated by lust. I don't want to neuter myself and have lifeless love with you by contracepting this act, but perhaps. I want to bring children into the world with you. At least I want to be open to that possibility. I want our love to be faithful, you and you only. And pornography is the sort of opposite of that. It's not free, total, faithful, and fruitful. It's sort of, and maybe this sounds like a bit of an extreme, but I think to some degree it's not free, it's enslaved, it's not total, it's partial, if barely partial. It appears that I'm engaging in a sexual act, having an intimate moment with someone who doesn't even know I exist. It's not faithful, it's faithless, and it's not fruitful, it's sterile. I'm masturbating. And so it's the opposite of what the conjugal act ought to be. And so if I've trained myself through viewing pornography that this is how the sexual act ought to be, what I'll end up doing is transfer that lustful mindset onto my bride. And as I heard one bride say, it feels like he's not making love to me. He's just using me as a warm body to masturbate with, which is a really disgusting thing to say. And I think when you hear it, it grosses you out. And I think it should gross you out. And I think that this is very often what pornography leads us to do. It perverts our desires, and then those desires are foisted onto another human being. And that human being feels the injustice of it.
Yeah. No, that's well put. It's ugly to look at, but significant. So this is not just a religious consideration. It's not just a religious issue. And you point that out, especially with the no-fap kind of phenomenon that's taking place. Can you play that out some for our audience? Because I'm not sure if they're necessarily aware of it.
Of no-fap?
Yeah, and just like I guess the myth that this is just a religious issue.
Right. Yeah, so I mentioned the studies that have been coming out of academia earlier in our discussion, and I would say that as these studies trickle out from the ivory tower of academia, people are beginning to realize this is just I would like to be healthy, or at least partly that. I would like to have a beautiful love life. I would like to live a more beautiful life, and pornography is robbing me of that. And so because of that, so many people now are speaking out against porn. James Hetfield, the lead singer of Metallica, just narrated an anti-porn documentary called Chasing the Cardboard Butterfly. Kanye West spoke about how porn messed him up. Terry Crews has spoken openly on Facebook about his own use of porn and how he began to find freedom. Comedian Chris Rock spoke openly about how, and courageously, I think, about how porn led to his divorce. Pamela Anderson, the Playboy bunny of the 90s, said those who watch porn are losers. I don't think I'd say that, but she did, which is illustrative that some sort of change is taking place. So yeah, this is not just a religious issue. I have religious reasons for thinking that porn is wicked and that it'll condemn our souls to hell. But in the book, The Porn Myth, I stay very clear from religious arguments and just sort of present the science and the logic, I think.
No, that's helpful, Matt. So when it comes to our current, I guess, cultural moment when it comes to a sexual ethic, you have, like, I think part of Proven's ministry, we're constantly hearing stories about kids and what they're getting into and what they're practicing at school, on the school buses, all sorts of things. How significant or how much of a contributor do you see pornography within the current, I guess, sexual ethic of our country?
As it pertains to children specifically, or just in general?
Yeah, I think to children in particular, but then also how it's impacting our again, ethical imaginations for what romance and love are.
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on. It almost doesn't need to be answered because the question sort of answers itself. We all see it pretty clearly. Yeah, human behaviors have meaning. If I was to grab a man by the throat and squeeze his, neck together and say, live, I'm clearly doing something that's at odds with what I'm saying. There is a meaning to different actions. Sexuality has a meaning, and we can thwart that meaning. We can pervert that meaning. And I think that it's very clear when you look at sex from a naturalistic point of view that it has at least two main meanings, and that is an openness to life and also the good of the two coming together. And I think that if you engage in sex in a way in which you deliberately thwart one of those two ends, as a Catholic, I would say that contraception is a way of thwarting that end. In vitro fertilization would thwart one of those ends in that you get the openness to life without the bonding. What you've done is you've perverted the sexual act. I would liken it to bulimia, where the point of eating is not taste, not comfort. It's actually nutrition. Taste and comfort might motivate me to eat. It might, I might go for the pleasure that I receive after eating. But the point of it from a naturalistic point of view is nutrition. If I was to eat and make myself throw up, I've perverted eating. And I think something similar could be said when it comes to pornography. And so if we're viewing sex, which is contrary to what it ought to be, then we are learning a lie, not just about what sex is, but about what humans are and humans are for. Going back a bit ago to the whole predator and treasure sort of thing, So I think, it carries a lie into marriage. It would be like watching hours about how everybody betrays everybody. So you think of some sort of terrible show where everybody's always betraying each other and that this is really friendship and that's all you ever knew, and then you got into friendship. It would probably pervert the way you understand friendship. And my fear is, because parents are giving their children iPhones and iPads and these sorts of things, their children's first experience of sexuality is a perverse and indeed demonic one. And so we as parents, who are the primary educators of our children, ought to talk to our children about the goodness of sex and prevent them from encountering pornography, so that when they do encounter the counterfeit, it will stand in contrast to the truth that they've already been told, as opposed to the other way around, where they first encounter the lie about sex and then we try to correct it. And very often it can be difficult to do.
Right, where the lie becomes the template for their imaginations, and then you have to try and I guess acculturate them into something else. Yeah, I hear that. I think that's significant, and it's helpful language. When it comes to a myth or a lie that seems fairly common, is that I could stop if I wanted to, that porn isn't actually addictive. I think one of the things that was helpful with you pointing out, and other research continues to come out since your book, that even the gray matter in your brain when you're watching porn, it makes you dumber. It jacks up some of your neural pathways and whatnot. But a lot of people seem to think that when it comes to porn, it's I could stop if I wanted to. How do you engage that? What kind of research do you pull from when people do say that porn isn't addictive?
So I think the reason people want to say that pornography is not addictive might be for a number of reasons, right? Maybe they've encountered people who hide behind the term addiction as if they're some sort of victim, and therefore, the reason they can't stop isn't because of them, isn't because their willingness to try or to seek help, but because of something external to them, something they can't overcome, like a physical handicap. And I think some people hear that and they rightly sort of say, look, this is ridiculous. Take responsibility for your own bloody life. And stop appealing to addiction as if you're some sort of victim. So I think that can be true, and it can also be true that pornography is addictive. If addiction means anything, if it's not just a word we use to describe people who are in over their head, if it is like a neurological term, and I think most people would agree that it is, even if they're not very sure how to explain it. But if you could say to somebody, all right, do you think that alcohol can be addictive? And maybe even if they're not really sure what that means, they might say, well, yes, but why don't you think pornography is addictive? And they say, well, because it's not a chemical that you're bringing into your body. It's totally different. It's behavioral. And that's true, but since neuroscientists started looking into the brain, it's changed how we understand addiction. Behaviors we now know can be just as addictive as substances. This is why the DSM-5 puts pathological gambling as a legitimate addiction, though nothing is ingested, So pornography can be addictive. It does affect the brain in very similar ways to how substances affect the brain when the brain becomes addicted. And so I would just point to the fact that I think we have 46 or maybe more now neuroscience-based studies on porn users that support the addiction model. The only 2 studies that are cited when trying to disprove that porn is addictive are 2 anomalous studies by Nicole Prouse, both of which have been just eviscerated by some of the world's top neuroscientists. That is to say, they're basically saying to this poor Nicole Prouse, look, you've misunderstood your findings. Your study works, but you've misunderstood it. So all of the studies point to the fact that pornography is addictive. Now, here's one kind of interesting thing. There's a great book that was written, The Brain That Changes Itself. Oh, who wrote that? The Brain That Changes Itself, published by Penguin Books. Gosh, I'm forgetting who wrote it now. He said that imagine you're in a forest and you have 2 pathways ahead of you. And maybe ever since you were a kid, you always went down this one pathway and you've never gone down this one. Well, over time, one will get easy to trod down and one will overgrow. He said that this is sort of like the neural pathways we can make in our brain. If ever since you were a kid, you had the urge to look at porn, you looked at porn, that path becomes very easy to walk down. And then the choice to go down the other road, that is to say not looking at porn, is quite difficult. But he says over time, you can forge a path through here. And as you cease going down this path, this one will become more difficult to go down. And so that's really good news, because I think sometimes people are trying to overcome pornography and they just think it's always going to be this bloody difficult. Like it's never going to let up. It's always going to be this matter of white knuckling it, doing everything I can. But that's just not the case, like neurologically speaking. That's something I found in my own life, and many people that I've spoken to have also found that. That's not to say that temptations are going to go away entirely. That's not to say that we can and I can fall tonight or tomorrow, make bad choices and choose to do evil things. Of course we can. But the brain can heal itself over time.
Amen. I think it's a helpful segue even into something like virtue ethics. I was talking with Nancy Piercy recently. She's done a lot of work on sexual ethics, and we were talking through how the biggest gifts or the biggest blessings from Jesus can end up being the biggest idols when they're abused or when they're misappropriated, and you see something like that take place with sex, with pornography, with hookup culture. And I had read recently somebody say that our cultural addiction to pornography is a cultural longing to be known. And there is this cry for intimacy, and it's just being routed in a really ugly direction. So when it comes to, we were talking about this earlier a little bit about kind of natural theology, natural revelation, the book of God's word, the book of God's world. So when it comes to, I guess, just a wholesome or beautiful kind of anthropology or starting point or humanity, when you're dialoguing with people or as you process this on your own, when it comes to like kind of a beginning and an end, how do you engage that? How do you frame it? And how do you conceive of it?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'm afraid I might not be as coherent as I'd like to be. You know, when you look at the Bible, it begins with a marriage. And when you look at the Bible, it ends with a marriage. In the beginning, you have Adam and Eve, and at the end, you have Christ in the church, right? Clearly, marriage is sort of very important for the Bible. I think our earthly marriages are foreshadowings, sacraments, if you want, with a small s, to the union that we're called to in heaven. So our blessed Lord says, you know, in heaven, people are not given in marriage, right? Because the sign has passed away. And so when I come together with my wife, I have this union with her, this intimacy with her. This is a foreshadowing of the intimacy I'll have with God. Now, we've got to be careful here. No one is meaning in a sexual sense. but it's a foreshadowing of something much greater that will be taking place in heaven. I'd look at that from a biblical point of view and say, so it's obviously very important. Sexual acts very important and good and beautiful. As far as the immorality, whenever we consider the immorality of something or whether or not something's moral, there are three things to take into consideration. So you have like the object, that is the act. You have the circumstances that surround the act, and then you have the intention of the actor. So all three need to be good for the act to be good. If one of these things is lacking, the act will be evil. And evil just means an absence of a good that ought to be there. So if I'm with you, Shane, and we walk past a homeless man and I give him money, but I do it primarily so that you'll think I'm a good person, even though the object is good, I've given him money, the circumstances might be good, he eats that day, because of my evil intention, the act is immoral. Like that's something I could legitimately repent of, right? That I did this so that he would think this about me. But certain things are intrinsically evil, right? So some things can be evil because of circumstance or intention, and then other things are intrinsically evil. And by intrinsically evil, we mean they're evil because of what they are. So like gambling, I would argue, is not an intrinsically evil act. I can gamble, I don't, but I could in moderation, and that this would be, not necessarily immoral. But then there are certain things I can engage in, and even if I were to engage in them sparingly, it would be intrinsically evil. Like if I was to, I don't know, shout racial slurs at my next door neighbor, suppose he was of a different race than me. I don't think anyone would say, well, everything in moderation. They would say, no, that's like, you're a crappy human being, stop it, And I think that pornography fits into this category of intrinsically evil acts. So pornography is not evil because it is addictive. It's not evil because it can ruin marriages. I mean, it is evil because of those things. What I mean is it's not merely evil because of those reasons. It's not merely evil because I can waste a lot of money and waste a lot of time. It's not merely evil, all the circumstantial things that we could point to. And many of those are very convincing, like erectile dysfunction and these sorts of things. I think that pornography is evil because of what it is. So if someone's only watching pornography for 5 minutes once a year, I think they're doing an intrinsically evil thing that they should repent of. Because when one consumes pornography, they're treating another person as a means to a selfish end, and merely as a means to a selfish end. And Karol Wojtyła, in his book Love and Responsibility, said the human person is a good towards which the only proper and adequate attitude is love. And he contrasted love with use. So if the opposite of love, in his opinion, is use. So if I love, what that means is I'm willing your good for your sake. I'm not willing your good for my sake. I'm willing your good for your sake. But the opposite of that is to will my good at your expense. And I think whenever one engages in pornography, this is something that's taking place. Whenever someone's consuming pornography, they're engaging in an intrinsically disordered action. And so I think that's something I find very interesting.
Yeah, I recall a part of Lewis's argument in Mere Christianity was oriented in that direction. I think he was arguing that, actually with masturbation, that masturbation in of itself is when it's done as an individual, then it's evil because it's done for self-pleasure as opposed to give pleasure and receive pleasure from another. So even that isolation model of something that's done, it's not necessarily like you can envision, your wife or whoever you want. That's not the point at all. It's not necessarily what you're envisioning.
That's right. And one of the things he points out, this was a letter that he wrote. He says, among those shadowy brides, so he has in his mind somebody imagining, a sexual act. And so he refers to these imaginings as shadowy brides. He says, among shadowy brides, he, that is the man masturbating, is always adored, always the perfect lover. No demand is ever made on his vanity, right? And so this person, and what he says in the end, I think sums it all up. He says, in the end, these shadowy brides, become merely the medium through which he increasingly adores himself. So that's one of the problems with masturbation.
That's heavy language, yeah, and even something like the book of Proverbs is framed that way, where in one sense it's the story of two women. You have Lady Lust and Lady Wisdom, and they're, like when you look at some of the reasons that people engage in pornography, it is because like she tucks me in at night, she's there with me when I'm bored, she always loves me, she looks the way that I want, and she'll take on 100 different forms however I want her. And it really is the way that we end up practicing pornography. And even like hookup culture when it comes to like dating apps and whatnot, where it's like guys constantly talking about how many different kinds of women they slept with that week, and there really is just kind of this what's the word? It's just this amalgamation of women that we then end up fashioning into our own image. Because I mean, as you point out in your book, the significance of novelty when it comes to sex is it's a powerful drug that drives us in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yep, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm with you on all that, and it's extremely helpful to hear you articulate it. So I like to the thing that you were pulling out where Genesis and Revelation starts and ends with marriage. I think that's a helpful image, and even hearing you articulate, the only reason I'm reiterating is because it's worth reiterating that a lot of people think that they can't know maybe intimacy or being known unless they're in marriage, and so marriage ends up being the point, and then it can actually end up being kind of insular once people end up getting marriage. So you see some of the damage in that direction too, and
great point.
The church and the bride of Christ end up knowing that affection and knowing that there are other, the word you used was signs, that then end up pointing us in that direction. But like marriage in and of itself isn't the only one. And,
right. It's not the destination. That's exactly right. And I mean, anyone who's married knows this, and I know this. I've even been learning this anew in my relationship with my wife right now. Like, there are times I turn to her expecting her to satiate the deepest longings that I have. And I'm not talking sexually necessarily. I'm talking about my emotional longings, my desire to be understood, for her to get where I'm coming from. And sometimes we do turn to our spouse and we're looking for God. And as my friend Christopher West has said, don't hang your hat on a hook that was never meant to hold the weight. And if we turn to our wife or husband to satisfy all of our desires, we will crush them because they are not God, and they are not the fulfillment of all desire that we anticipate in heaven.
That's helpful, Matt. So when it comes to so whether somebody is married or single, how do you start them on that journey towards restoration, helping them encounter the sanctification and redemption that Jesus died and rose to give them? When it comes to, even in those moments, I mean, you probably had to minister to your own soul in those moments when you expect something of your wife that you shouldn't expect from your wife. It's a kind of intimacy that only Jesus can meet you in those spaces, in those places. How do you actively move towards him? Again, this kind of pulls back on some of those virtue ethics that we were talking about earlier, but like, what does it then look like to actively partner with God's Spirit and move towards him? And just find healing and restoration.
Yeah, so first I would say, because you pointed out if someone's single or married, let me just quickly dispel a myth that I think sometimes single people tell themselves. And it's something like, well, if I were married, right, I could have a legitimate outlet, and therefore, wouldn't need pornography. But since I am single, pornography is my only outlet. This is something I need right now, but later on I won't need it. And so it's somehow more okay given that I'm single. And to that I would say this, thinking that a porn addict can be healed through sex, that's like thinking a gambling addict will cease gambling if you just give him a bag of cash. And I think we can see why that's the case. I mean, if somebody's legitimately addicted and you go, oh, you're addicted, so you must want money. Like, here's a suitcase of like $20,000 or more. We see why that doesn't work. And you say, well, why? And then you have to reflect on it. And I guess you'd say something like, well, I guess he's not really just after the money, is he? Maybe money's not even the primary thing he wants. And I think that's probably close to spot on. And I think that's something true of the porn addict. Like what he wants, in a sense, is not more sex. What he's kind of conditioned himself to is this endless clicking, this novelty, this desire to be seen, to be let in, to be wanted, So I would just kind of say that really quickly.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And then what was your other question?
When it comes to, I guess, just walking people, whether they're married or single, towards knowing Jesus in that kind of intimacy that their soul is obviously longing for.
I think that sometimes, we think our only options are indulge or abstain. In other words, these are really my only two options. And so I either have to repress or go to excess. You might want to put it that way.
Sure.
But these aren't the only two options. If you knew somebody who was once a thief, you would recognize that, okay, it's possible for this person to become an honest man or an honest woman. But for some reason, when it comes to sexuality, we have this idea that we always have to be lustful, that we always have to be engaged in deviant sexual activity or just become super repressive or some such. But this isn't the case. Saying that our only options are to indulge or repress, that's a little bit like saying our only options when it comes to our health is, anorexia and becoming obese. It's like, no, you can be healthy too, You could moderate your use of food and intake of it and exercise. So there's a virtue we call chastity, which is that virtue which enables us to act in accord with our sexual desires in the proper way. And so that's a real possibility for us. Now, as far as me personally, this happened the other night. I just had this tremendous longing in my heart for I knew not what. And I think whenever I start to get that, I know that that's about our Lord. St. John of the Cross in his poetry talks of God as I know not what. That's what he calls him. I know not what. And so just the other night, I was just feeling this tremendous restlessness and this desire to kind of like, why can't my wife meet me in this place? And it was good just to kind of go on a long walk and to pray and to kind of like pour out my heart before the only one who's the fulfillment of my desires and that sort of thing. And then we had a lovely discussion about it last night. But it really does take the burden off, if my wife looks to me to satisfy all of her desires, bloody hell, she won't be in for much luck. So, but when she realizes that it's to someone else she needs to turn, and I realize the same thing, I think that's a much better, much healthier marriage right there.
Yeah, I think some of those older brothers and sisters in the faith, it's Teresa of Avila, with her interior castle, where her main thesis is that you can't show hospitality to the people around you unless you've learned to show hospitality to God's Spirit within you, and I think it's a rich point that you could mine for the rest of your life, and so like learning to know Jesus in your interior castle, I think it's significant, especially right now with all the isolation, with the coronavirus, having us practice life the way we are. There's a lot of opportunity to know Jesus in those still moments. Honestly, practicing stillness is one of the hardest spiritual formations in my life. Like scripture memory, all those things. But like practicing stillness, just like abiding with him and being present to whatever he decides to show you.
Sitting in the mess without wanting to control it. Bloody hard work, yeah.
Yeah, dude. It's very much a mess. And so you see people swing the other direction where like all of a sudden we're still and we don't know what to do with that stillness. And so you see this huge spike in pornography because they're lonely and they want affection, but Jesus is there in that space and wanting to know them.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think it's valid. So I appreciate a lot of those mystics. They've formed a lot of, again, my ethical imagination when it comes to just knowing Jesus in those places. Yeah. So Matt, you obviously the porn myth. How long ago did you write the porn myth?
Gosh, I don't know. 3 years ago, I think.
That's
came
awesome,
out.
Man.
It's in Korean. It's about to. I think it's in a few other languages too now. So it's been kind of fun.
Yeah, no, that's
But
really
it's
cool,
also
man.
on Audible if people want it. And I have to say this because sometimes it motivates people to get it. 100% of the royalties go to help sexually trafficked victims in San Diego. There's a group called Children of the Immaculate Heart who help people. So I don't make a cent from the book. That's not why I push it. I mean, I like money, but that's I don't make money from that book, and I think people would get a lot out of it.
No, that's helpful. So the porn myth, you also have some other resources that you've created to help people through this process. Yeah,
let me mention two. One is an app I created called Victory. It's totally free. It's basically check it out. It's really well produced. We put a lot of money into this thing. It has a countdown. It tells you how many hours and days you've been free of pornography. If you feel tempted, have you seen it, Shane?
I haven't seen it.
Oh,
no.
Please check it out. It's great. If you feel tempted, you put up to 3 accountability partners in settings. You click one button, they all get a notification on your phone just saying something very simple. Please pray for Matt. There's reflections that I've written. Again, there's no in-app purchases. It's 100% free, and it's very beautiful and sophisticated. It's called Victory. And then I have a 21-day detox from porn course called strive21.com. It's 21 days. I journey with somebody, take them from where they are and just slowly guide them day by day. You get like a 5 or so minute video every day, a challenge you have to perform. We have over 14,000 men going through the course right now. And so many men are kind of becoming quite close, choosing to be accountability partners with each other and that sort of thing. So it's strive21.com, strive21.com, 100% free. And you can be as anonymous as you want. So I'd say any men out there struggling with lust in any way, please check it out. And I also want to say that even though I'm a Catholic, I have a lot of love and esteem for my evangelical brothers and sisters. And this was a kind of ecumenical effort. So even if you're not a Catholic, you will in no way, shape, or form feel kind of out of place in this, because I gave these different presentations with evangelicals and Catholics in mind. So the language won't be alienating.
No, that's helpful, Matt. Thank you. And Matt, you're always kind of working on stuff. How can people maybe like track with you with your thoughts? You have a podcast. Can you go ahead and share that with our audience as well?
Sure. It's called Pints with Aquinas. There you go. Pints with Aquinas. Aquinas was a 13th century philosopher, theologian, and the whole idea is to kind of introduce people to these deep philosophical and theological discussions in a kind of lighthearted way.
That's really cool. I like it. I think I like the model of it, especially because you take we have such a premium on winsomeness in our culture, but like taking people who have actually thought quite deeply about this and maybe don't have like a cultural stage, but they definitely have an academic stage, and you invite them on, then you just dialogue with them. I especially like that you'll ask a question, then you kind of just get out of the way, like you don't try.
I hope that's true.
Yeah.
Interviewing is a difficult thing, and there's definitely been interviews that I've done. I'm like, oh my gosh, I talk too much. I cut that person off, but it's a work in progress. But thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Now, me and you both. So I definitely recommend it. Matt, thank you for being with us, man. It's just been a pleasure to mix it up with you and dialogue through this stuff.
I'm thrilled to hear about your great ministry. I mean, I didn't know y'all existed, and then I looked y'all up, and I'm seeing the impact you're making, and I was just so honored that you'd invite me to be on the show. So thanks for having me.
For sure, man. For sure. Guys, thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed the show, go ahead and just leave us a review, and we'll catch you next time.